Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Media Diversity Institute. We're going to be talking on the media's reporting on the ongoing protests in Iran. I'm Shada Islam, an EU commentator and analyst based here in Brussels, and I'm honored to facilitate this very important discussion. So we've all been following and writing about these protests in Iran, which erupted after the death of 22-year-old Gina Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish woman and student who died on September 16th last year after the Iranian morality police took her into custody for allegedly wearing un-Islamic dress. The protests have now been going on for 6 months. They were initially directed against the compulsory wearing of the hijab, but the calls for women, life, and freedom have quickly morphed into a wider, deeper, and very powerful challenge to the government in Iran. And the state security services are hitting back with violence, killings, and detentions. More than 60 journalists have been arrested, according to Amnesty International. The bravery of these women, in fact, the bravery of these people, because these protests have been joined by men, conservative women, older people, and younger ones, is very, very remarkable. It reflects frustration also at years of economic hardship, corruption, and a desire for change and reform. What we'll be trying to do over the next 60 minutes is to explore where the media has got things wrong and what journalists, especially journalists in mainstream media, need to take into consideration when reporting on the country. Joining me for this conversation are a wonderful group of 3 women. First, Sanam Naraghi Anderlini. Sanam, welcome. MBE, founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network. Thank you very much, Sanam, for joining us. Also joining us is Rafia Zakaria, a Pakistani-American attorney, media diversity journalist, and author of this very wonderful book that everyone should be reading now, Against White Feminism. And Marianna Karakoulaki, Media Diversity Institute's communication manager, journalist, and PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham. Thank you very much, all 3, for joining me. So the rules of engagement are very simple. I'm going to be asking these wonderful women questions for the first 25 minutes or so, and then turn to you, all our wonderful participants, for your Q&A part of it. So put your questions, any comments, please make them short so I can read them out to our panelists, and put them in the Q&A box, please. So thank you very much indeed, once again, for joining us. So Sanam, let's start the conversation with you. As I said, protests now going on for 6 months, getting more powerful by moments, but then also subsiding because there's such a harsh crackdown from the authorities. So just give us a general view of the protests and what they mean as far as you're concerned about the future of the Iranian regime and how far the protests can go in getting real change in Iran.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. These are big questions. So I think, first of all, what we are, we don't hear enough, to be honest with you, because so much of the reporting is really reliant on local social media and people being able to upload images and news and so forth onto the net. And so connectivity, I think, is itself, it's an issue. That said, I think that what we saw, and I think it's still present, but it may be manifesting itself in different ways, is the eruption of the culmination of 3 generations of women pushing back against the essential ideological discriminatory of the regime, right? So it wasn't suddenly something new. It wasn't. It's not suddenly something that, because there've been external voices saying we should remove the hijab and so forth, that this is happening. This has been it's been like a river that's been building and building and building, and then the dam bursts and you have a 3rd generation that is coming out. And of course, the moment of Mahsa Amini was really critical in terms of being the trigger to get people out. The regime's crackdown is not surprising. This is what they do. This is their modus operandi. They did it in 1999 with student protests. They did it in 2009 when people were out there on the streets against because of the internal coup during the elections, and they've done it again now. Their approach is to sow as much fear as possible to try and push people back. So there's heavy crackdowns and then some back down. And there's always an ambiguity about, are they really allowing things to be changed or not? And that's one of the challenges that, we'll see images, we'll see pictures, we'll hear from friends and family. They were out without the hijab in some places, and then at another time they're being, there's crackdown, or they'll say one thing in parliament, and then, so there is an ambiguity about it, which is about control as well. But Iranian women and girls have consistently pushed back against the mandatory hijab, which is both symbolic and a physical sense of, every time you go out of the house to be forced into a certain garb and so forth. So if you look back at the images from the 1980s to now, it's a very different picture, right? When I went back in 1986, I could only show my face. Everything had to be black. Everything had to be white. Over the years, women have put their lives at risk over and over to push it back an inch, to shorten it at the back, and shorten the coats and so forth. So this dialogue, if you want, of what women do and how they do it nonviolently, how the state comes back violently, has been ongoing. And right now, again, we don't hear about mass protests so much, but you can't change the mindset. When you have 11, 12-year-old girls giving the finger or tearing down photographs or saying women life freedom, you can't change that sense of freedom. You can scare them, which is what they're doing with school poisonings and so forth, right? Trying to shut things down. But you don't change people's attitudes. And what I think is really important is that this is not only, as you said, did it cut across the sort of boundaries of sex, gender and race and ethnicity and geography and so forth that it mobilized. This was a feminist message. It wasn't just a women-led revolution or movement. We've seen that in other countries. This is deeply feminist in terms of the message that it's conveying. It is the Achilles heel of the entire identity of the regime, because this regime's ideologically it's anti-Israel, anti-America, but it's social. Where does it say it's Islamic? It's in how it treats women. Right. And so that's the tension. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanam. Indeed, the generations of women that are coming out, and Rafia, you and I spoke some time ago also about the issue of how non-white feminists are actually now in the lead when it comes to bodily autonomy for women and also their freedom, their choices to be made. So I was wondering if you could come in and explain to us how you think that what's happening in Iran and possibly also elsewhere in the Muslim world is actually an indication of forces that are being unleashed that perhaps we in Europe haven't really understood very well.
Yes, thank you, Shada, and thank you everyone for your comments. I think that it's long been one of the, I would say, fallacies of feminism or Western feminism in general that they think that the politics of protest, of, occupying public spaces, of making yourself visible as women somehow originated in the West, and then, everyone else is being sort of, got the gospel and started following it. But, one of the most hopeful things about the Iranian women is the amount of the amount of courage that they have shown. In terms of bodily autonomy, one interesting parallel that I see, not perhaps in the Muslim world, but just to show the relative courage of Iranian women, is that Iranian women are risking their lives. They're on the streets. They've kept these protests going. They're, as you well said, across generations, across class and economic lines. Here in the United States, we are facing another huge attack on bodily autonomy in terms of the rolling back of reproductive rights, and more recently, even the rolling back of reproductive rights in terms of the medical care and medicines that are available to women. And so there's definitely, you can definitely see this common core of authoritarian and fascist, anti-women, misogynistic leaders using the bodily control of women as an indicator of their power. In that sense, I feel almost like Iranian women are ahead of American women, because they have organized this movement. They are out in the streets. It's not that American women are not suffering since the rollback of Roe, and also now since the Texas ruling against medical abortion, or like the pill essentially.
Right.
But there isn't there isn't an uprising, right? Like, they're not in the streets, even though they directly stand to they're in danger, like, by and large, because especially even the pill is not just used for that purpose. It is used for a lot of other reproductive procedures as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that parallel is absolutely crucial and must be kept in mind.
Thank you, Rafia. Thank you for making that point. So Marianna, coming to you, 3 generations of women out in the streets. Sanam talked about schoolgirls as well being under attack. So what does this say about the power of youth and Generation Z in Iran in these protests?
Well, the Generation Z in Iran are the driving force of these protests, and they are a force to be reckoned with. They grew up. They are too young to remember the revolution, the post-revolution events, and they are too young to remember what has happened throughout this period, including 9/11. So they do not have the fear that the Iranians used to have. They might have the trauma, but they have not lived that trauma. So they're not afraid, and we can see it by looking on social media. So if you look on Instagram, Instagram is the social media that has not been that much censored as much as the others. They're very active there. They were active before September, and they continue to be active now. So they're risking their lives for freedom, and we can see this in the message that they have: woman, life, freedom. They're risking their lives for freedom. They want freedom. And they know that there may be a violent crackdown as it happens. They know that Khamenei might react the way they reacted in 81, but they're not afraid. And this is something that makes these protests quite different to the protests that we have seen before. I think the protests are going to continue. I think the focus is still going to be on Generation Z. But I still think that it's too early to say what is going to happen next, because Iran is such a complicated country, and the society is so complex, and we need to be really careful about our predictions for the future. Shada, you're muted.
Yeah, I muted because I was coughing. Sorry. Yes, we're going to talk about the media's role in this, and our perceptions, of course, here in the West, because we're all 3 of us in the West as we speak, have been colored, influenced by how the mainstream media, we'll talk about social media in a minute, but about the media, the mainstream media's portrayal of what is happening. And of course, they're getting their messages through the diaspora, I guess, but also through telephone calls and contacts and networks with Iranian women in Iran itself. So I'm starting with you. Where do you think, because there is a sense, all 4 of us share, of a certain degree of frustration and how the media has been rather one-dimensional in its portrayal of what's happening in Iran. So tell me a little bit about how you see things, Sanam, and then Rafia and Marianna.
Thank you. I think there's different ways of thinking about this, but I'll just make two points that for me have been interesting. So one is that, the Western media, especially the Western media, in the last 40 years that I've lived in the West and the last 20 years that I've lived in America, if you ask the average person, what's your perception of Iran? right? If they're older, it's hostage crisis and yellow bands and yellow ribbons around trees, and if they're younger, it's nuclear and it's bearded angry men and this kind of dark cloud, right? So I think that was always that's kind of a stereotype, and that's a one-dimensional version of Iran. It always has been. And this is the contrast to that, because now all of a sudden it's this excitement about young girls and not only young girls and women, but young girls and women that look like our kids here, right? So that kind of affinity that these children are our children, right? So there's something about, but again, this is also in a way it's like looking at it with, not in terms of how Iran is and how Iranians see themselves, but the way that the West wants to interpret Iran. So it's again very one-dimensional. I've heard, I think it was Jessica Chastain or one of these actresses saying, this is a women-led, revolution. I'm like, yes, there was a woman-led revolution in Sudan. There was a woman-led revolution in Yemen. With Tunisian women were there. The issue here, as I said, is not necessarily that it was women-led. It's that the message of women, life, freedom, is transformative. It's not even saying equality in the status quo. It's saying life and freedom. And if you listen to the song Baraye, which talks about these things, it's really about a different, as I say, it's a feminist transformative lens. And that hasn't really been picked up in the media here. The second point I want to make is, because Iran is so vilified in the West, and it's a country that is a rogue state, and it's an adversary, there's a lot of excitement about look at what the women are doing, and is this going to be the toppling of the regime? It's very, again, the analysis is skin deep in many ways. If you contrast that with the women of Afghanistan, who for the last 16 months have been sitting and facing the barrel of the Taliban, right? And they're at it consistently. We don't cut that media is not covering that. Why aren't we talking about that in the same context? And I think that it's partly because the Afghan situation is the West's doing. The situation on the ground in Afghanistan is the fault of NATO. It's not even the fault of NATO. It's the fault of American political decision-making and an abject failure of the diplomacy to hand the country back to the Taliban at the negotiating tables in Doha. So they don't want to, they want to like say, oh, back mirror, we don't want to talk about Afghanistan. But you have to look at the two together and understand and then figure out what it is that the media is doing and the perceptions that they're trying to play into.
And Rafia, from your point of view, what do you see as the narrative that's coming across? I mean, it's very much focused also on this mandatory hijab issue as well. So it's all been turned into, what women will put on their heads. As usual, when we look at Muslim women, it's all about sartorial choices, isn't it?
Right. I personally was quite disgusted with Jessica Chastain's, comments, as I've been with the other celebritification of this particular issue. The cutting of hair and all of this performative affinity when there really isn't any engagement with the actual issues. I mean, I would even say that in some ways, the Iranian situation is also part of America's fault in terms of what has happened, what they have done to Iran economically, and so my frustration is centrally on that issue, but also, I mean, history is like, Americans are not interested, or Westerners are not interested in history, so they're not interested in the genealogical origins of all of these problems, and the fact that these performative politics of the veiling and unveiling have been encouraged in different ways, or sort of created as a foil to represent the relative freedom of Western women who don't wear the hijab. But I mean, my frustration is partly about that there isn't any progress whatsoever in the way Muslim women are being covered. So, I mean, Afghanistan, they've forgotten altogether. Americans do not remember that. even though they were there for 20 years. Even when Afghan women are presented now, it's presented as if like America was never there. And, you know, and the horrible Taliban, which indeed are the horrible Taliban, and these women. And now with Iran, once again, it's sort of like this we were right after all attitude, in that the regime we have opposed for decades, and now the Iranian people are waking up and realizing that this regime is horrible. And so I mean, I find that absolutely condescending and extremely, extremely disturbing, because that is not the case at all. But Americans very much like they seem to have tunnel vision, in that they see solidarity existing only existing in the form of like, how do we help these women, without having any interest whatsoever in the complicity of Americans in producing that situation, or or even like, you know, trying to think of ways in which some of the economic stressors on these women, Afghan and Iran, could be lifted, or could help produce a different result. So it's extremely disappointing. I honestly do not watch Western coverage of Iran or Afghanistan anymore for this reason. Or I mean, you know, if I do watch it, I end up having to write about it, because like it's absolutely you know, it makes my blood boil. So
it's painful.
So, yes,
absolutely painful sometimes to read this as a woman here. I would say Western indifference in a sense. So we, Media Diversity Institute, and some of us did a study on how Muslim women are portrayed in Belgium and Spain in the press articles, and it was really quite interesting. So obviously often as victims, sort of without agency, you know, focusing very much on the hijab. So agency, no agency, or seen as very militant and part of some kind of Islamist conspiracy. And then of course there's also the Sherzadeh complex, which is that, you know, these are women, wonderful exotic women who have to be you know, saved from repressive men.
Going back to the issue of bodily control, though, one of the central, I mean, you know, French women, for instance, have been very upfront, like, oh, solidarity with Iranian women, etc. But like, you know, I mean, if their bodily control is concerned, their government is directly involved in the bodily control of Muslim women within France. So, I mean, it frustrates me that people cannot see that all of these, you know, different powers are using bodily control. The issue is the bodily control of women, and not, and you know, there's no man in the world who has to face stuff like this, you know. But we are still trying to, you know, make that point. Yes.
Exactly. No, thank you very much indeed, Rafia. So let's talk a little bit about the social media, because, you know, the internet has been shut down. And as you said, Marianna, that Instagram has become quite important. And I read also that there was Telegram that has become important, in, you know, WhatsApp as well. So media, you can control it to a point. You can shut down the internet, but people still manage to communicate with each other. So what are the messages that social media is providing us on what's happening in Iran? How authentic are they?
Well, it really depends, because you need to have the ability to distinguish which message is true and which message is not true. When it comes to social media in general, they have been central in protests in the Middle East. So we have seen it during the Arab Spring. Twitter became what it is for journalists now because of the Arab Spring. Instagram seems to be becoming the same for the protests in Iran. However, we have to be careful when it comes to social media, and we have to be careful about the people we are following and the people that we trust, because the information that is shared there is not really monitored. When it comes to Twitter, Twitter itself has become such a big mess that I don't think you can really trust it at the moment. But the only way that Iranians at the moment have a voice is through certain social media. Telegram is one of these, which I have my personal doubts when it comes to Telegram because of recent leaks. Instagram is another one. And even if the regime tries to shut them down, they will not shut down. People are going to find ways to reach out to others. They're going to be using old ways of using the internet, like cabled internet. I have an example in my mind now. I remember during some protests a few years ago when the internet was shutting down. I think it was during the Arab Spring. There were people with expertise on the Tor network, for example, or on this kind of dark internet sites, that they were giving their expertise to people to be able to access the internet. So people are going to find a way to speak up, even if it's through the phone by talking to their peers outside Iran, or even if they are risking their lives just to access a telephone line to be able to share themselves online. But as I said, we have to be very careful when it comes to social media, and we have to be very careful on whom we trust. And when it comes to the Iranian protest, there is an Instagram account that it has become quite trustworthy, and they are sharing information, and they're sharing videos from the country. And this is called 1500 Tasvir. And I think this is one of the few accounts that we can really trust, and we can see what is going on in the country.
Right.
Because
so Sanam,
they filter the information that they have.
Right. Okay. So Sanam, for you also getting information from what's happening in Iran, and Marianna's talked about the importance of trust and confidence in the sources of information. What do you think are the ways to get the best information? And is our media using those channels? Lost Sanam for the moment. You're back in. Did you hear my conversation? Did you hear my question?
Yeah, I mean, I did. Yeah, I did. So, is that mainstream media way of
we're not getting a very good.
So forth. So some triangular.
The audio is not very good at the moment. So I'm going to go to Rafia, but I'll come back to you just as we arrange your audio. So, and also please, to all the participants here, please do send us some questions coming in as well. So please send me a few questions that you want to ask our three panelists. Rafia, I took the question to you then about the trustworthiness of sources.
I think that the way I look at it from the perspective of movement building and linkages, the fact is that social media in its multitudinous forms has really drastically lowered the cost of exchanging information. Of course, there are issues with verification in terms of how trustworthy a source is or isn't, what sort of malign interests some may have. But, some of those, particularly to people who are really following the movement from a day-to-day basis, those are discernible. And also, there's information that can be put out that can help ordinary people be better able to discern what is true or not. But I think that, the fact is that there are so many ways now of contacting people on the outside, so to speak, that I would say that it's almost impossible for any regime anywhere in the world to completely, clamp down on these sources. People will use them, and particularly Generation Z is very, very adept internationally wherever you see them. I mean, we had that huge leak here in the US a few days ago
Sure.
by a 21-year-old, and so their literacy in terms of being able to not only parse sources, but also find ways in which they can get around the somewhat, archaic or bumbling measures of various regimes to clamp down on them are very impressive. And honestly, I feel that that it is particularly that literacy, and particularly the fact that Gen Z cannot even imagine a world where people are not linked in the way they are now, that is that is going to stand up to a lot of these authoritarian forces.
Right, Rafia. So Marianna, is that your feeling as well? And we're having trouble with Sanam. I think she needs to leave and then come back. And again, she says there's some work going on in her neighborhood that might be impacting on her connection. And I have a problem that I can't read my Q&A. Somehow that's not working. So if you could put your questions in the chat that I can read still, I'd really appreciate it. So coming back to the question of reporting and covering the protests in Iran, Marianna, do you think that this ingenuity of this Generation Z is really putting the focus on what's happening in Iran, and they're sort of driving the publicity and the visibility of these protests across the world?
I think it does, because if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have the information that we have now. Also, if you remember how the reporting on the protest started, initially it was all about the hijab, and then it all became all about ethnic differences. And it was because we didn't really have that much information. However, because of them, we know what is going on. And I don't think we should, I think we should pay a lot of attention to that. And I think we should start taking them seriously. We should start taking Generation Z in general very seriously, because they live on the internet. They know what they're doing. They know how the internet works, and they know how social media work. And they have a way of putting this information out for us. And as I said, because of them, we have the information that we need to have about Iran. If it wasn't for them, the information we would have would be very controlled. It would be from the Iranian media. It would be from experts, outside experts. And it would be much more controlled than it is now. If I can say, I really follow the information about Iran from this Instagram account that I mentioned earlier, because I can see what is going on in the country when it happens.
Right. So questions are coming in, and I'm waiting for Sanam. So maybe Rafia, you can say this. One question is about, this portrayal that Sanam talked about, and you do too, of Iran as the oppressed other, the barbaric nation, sort of violating all norms of Western values, if you like. And why do you think this is happening? Is it because we need to justify our own policies? For example, you talked about the sanctions that are enforced against Iran, which is causing great economic hardship. So is this vilification sort of part of a deliberate effort by the Western media and perhaps the Western authorities?
Yes, I mean, it's a sort of schizophrenic kind of attitude, isn't it? Because on one hand, we are so concerned, right? The attitude is we are so concerned about Iran, we're so concerned about Afghanistan, but at the same time, when it comes to the fact that they desperately need economic assistance, and even if you don't want to give monetary economic assistance, there are many ways to provide humanitarian and other forms of assistance that would greatly help both Iranians and Afghans. But those measures are never really taken seriously or considered because it's like, oh, well, if we do that, we're helping the regime. So I mean, I find it very frustrating that that sort of a very to me, very explicit bifurcation cannot be made in the fact that, you know, not all aid is money and guns. Like it's lots of other things that are desperately needed.
Can you give an example? Can you give an example, Rafia, of the other ways in which we can be providing assistance to the protesters?
I mean, quite honestly, right now, I mean, it could be. Here's one example, which is, you know, perhaps there are academics in the audience. I mean, we say so much about education in Iran, in Afghanistan, etc. But, you know, we do not allow Iranian scholars to have connectivity to all the different databases. They're very expensive to connect to, of knowledge, whether it's WorldCat, JSTOR, whatever. I mean, there are so many, but the fact is that, you know, not all exchange is like governmental exchange. Yeah. There's also a sort of epistemic isolation of these places that really, really frustrates me, because it means that Iranian scholars who are in many cases producing excellent work and excellent, you know, things that we need to know about Iran over the, you know, since 1979, you know, that we have had this big hole in information.
I see.
Those, I mean, that's just one small example.
Right. Okay. Now, thank you, Rafia. You're frozen now for the moment. So let me, yeah, you got frozen as well, Rafia. But thank you for that. Yeah, so thank you for that example. Marianna, just a question has come in about, is there any, from the MDI point of view, is there any mainstream media outlet, Western, I suppose, that has given a more accurate reflection of what's happening? And if it's not Western, I mean, this is a worldwide coverage of what's happening in Iran. Are there newspapers, media in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, in Africa, that are giving more substantial and more in-depth coverage rather than this shallow and superficial focus that we've seen in many of our Western mainstream media? Marianna?
One of the media that comes to my mind, and actually Melissa Pesic has already mentioned it in the chat, it's Iran Wire. I think it provides great analysis and great context about what is going in Iran. They have been active for several years, and I think it's one of the most trustworthy resources that we can have when it comes to Iran. Regarding other media in the Middle East, there are several, but when it comes to Iran, I think we have to look at it from a more geopolitical context. I personally do trust Al Jazeera, but at the same time, we do have all these questions when it comes to Al Jazeera, and the same thing goes for Middle East Eye or Al Arabiya. I do not speak the language, so I cannot really say about the media that are local in the Middle East. So when it comes to how we monitor what is happening in Iran, we take our information from news wires and about a wide variety of outlets. Iran Wire is number one for me personally.
Right.
But also, there are certain journalists who are providing really good analysis. For example, Ramita Navai, who has been very active in about Iran and very vocal about Iran and about Afghanistan as well. And I would say just trust the journalist rather than the media itself, because, as I said, Al Jazeera, it may be problematic for many, but there are some really good analysts, and there are good analysts in The Guardian and in other media as well.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sanam, you've been away for some time, and I'm really happy to see you back and active. So please go ahead and answer this question and the previous one about how we can help, actually, the protesters, please.
Absolutely. So on the media question, I think Marianna is absolutely right. You have to have a very fine-tuned, or take everything with a pinch of salt, because, you know, for example, a lot of people have taken their information from Iran International, English language, which is a Saudi-funded television channel. And since 2016, they've had a very particular approach to try and kind of, between that and another television channel called Manoto, of trying to sort of foster this nostalgia about how wonderful everything was in the past, and then really riling up the current protests. But not only doing that, also maligning analysts, institutions, even the BBC, right? So you have to know who's the source, who funds them, and what's their political agenda. The VOA similarly, very, very mixed. Sometimes there's it's reporting, and sometimes it's very skewed analysis, or the analysts that they bring have a particular lens on it. So it's very important to be able to sort of look at a variety of sources and think about it. And then one of the things that I've seen with both in the reporting of Afghanistan and Iran is that, those of us who are in the activist advocate space, we have access to people who are really at the front lines, and they have a feel for things and know what's going on, and can give you a sense of, okay, what the strategies are. If you go on as a journalist and you want to do Afghan women, and you're just doing the ordinary people who are that are just living and are not in the activist or political space, it's it's one angle on it, obviously, and it's very important, right? But it's also really important that we don't invisibilize the activists, the advocates, the folks that are the engine of change that is happening. So that question of how we balance these issues out. In terms of the question of how to help, I think the issue of connectivity is absolutely critical. All sorts of ways that people need to just, whether it's connecting to the internet, whether it's accessing different kind of what is it that they're being forced to pay to be able to get involved and be part of the connected to the world. So that's one side of it. The other side comes down to sanctions. Iran is the most sanctioned country in the world, right? And as we heard before, you can't say, oh, I care about the Iranian women and I'm going to, cut my hair here. But hey, we're not going to say anything about banking sanctions, which is affecting ordinary people and their families, and just the ability to do basic remittances or send basic medicine and so forth. So there is, these things are woven in together. And unfortunately, I think that one of the things that we've seen in the last 6 months is that the voices in the diaspora who became dominant in terms of shaping or being the let's say, the representatives, self-proclaimed representatives in many cases, would say things like, oh, no, sanctions doesn't have anything to do with this. This is economic mismanagement by the state. There is economic mismanagement by the state. There is corruption by the state. And there are sanctions. And by the way, sanctions enables the corruption. So it's not either or, it's not binary. It is integral to each other. And we as outsiders, as an Iranian diaspora, I always feel that it's my responsibility to make sure that whatever we're advocating for isn't doing more harm. The rule number one is do no harm, right? And then rule number two is what is in the country that I live, what is my government doing here that can help with the public there? And this nuance of issues the nuance is really hard to convey in social media and when people are emotional. The emotionality takes away any space for having rational kind of conversations about, okay, what's realistic, what's not, what's works, what's long-term, what's sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, what's happened in the last 6 months is that the extreme voices and the social media kind of attacks, even though this has been women life freedom, have been against women in the social media space. I mean, so many of us get horrific targeted messages trying to erase us, trying to discredit us, trying to making accusations which are so blatantly malicious and false, and trying to basically destroy our reputations. And it's the majority of people who are getting targeted are women analysts, and that tells you a lot about the sort of the psychology of patriarchy and so forth, and often by other women, by the way. So it's not just men attack. So there's something very strange that's happened in the social media spaces in this last 6 months.
Yeah, it's a very, very toxic environment, and I know exactly what you're talking about, Sanam, as well. And then, I mean, all of us as women who dare to say certain things on social media, who have independent views and not following any set line by any one person, autonomous, courageous are all targeted. And you're right, I've seen, how they've vilified all of us really on social media, but luckily there's support there as well. So that's something that always reassures me and gives me comfort and succor that there is a comfort to be had from networks that support you. So thank you very much for that. So I wanted to, as we come towards almost the end of our webinar, just ask you, all three of you, what could we do to make things better in terms of portrayal? Because all of the nuances that all three of you have brought to the discussion are just that. They're the nuances, right? And in a world where things happen very fast and where people are making snap judgments based on one or two binary and simplified portrayals, how do we bring that nuance, that sophistication, that depth of reflection into the media when we're covering situations such as that in Iran or Afghanistan or, say, Yemen, Sudan, etc.? How do we bring that sophistication, that knowledge into this public sphere, and get rid of these simplistic binary choices, the good, the bad, and the nice guys, the bad guys, the barbarians and the civilized? What we're really falling into this trap, and media isn't helping, is it? So should we start with you, Rafia, first, and then go to Marianna, and then to Sanam?
Sure. I mean, in my opinion, it's actually not that complicated. I think that the binaries need to be made explicit and talked about in all the news coverage of these places, because unless we start doing that, people are just going to not know about them, right? So, I mean, one very, very simple way is to, sort of say that that there is a proclivity towards binary coverage. West is good, East is bad, that these exotic Muslim women or militant Muslim women, and it's important to have these conversations, not just among us, but there is still among neoliberal institutions, there is still a very pointed, not an accidental, but a very pointed and intentional sort of drive to, or push to continue to present this as a binary, because they see the sort of darkness of Iran or Afghanistan as a way to shine a light on the Enlightenment principles that they're advocating. So those are very explicit, and they exist in not just in conservative media that might have a certain agenda in the West, but also among liberal institutions on the left. And so I would say that would be a great starting point.
Mm-hmm. Right. Sanam, did you want to come in? Yes, please.
I just want to add something. If you look at the region in the last 20 years, when the Iraq occupation happened, and it was in the name of democracy or getting rid of dictatorship and so forth, in the West or in the US, many of us say, oh, that war or that occupation was a failure, or Afghanistan was a failure. If you look at it from the standpoint of the three major powers that have arisen in the last 20 years and become the dominant influences and forces in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, actually what was done to Iraq, and the fact that you get rid of Saddam and then you create a sort of a state that's on its knees, and then similarly, what was done to Yemen, what was done to Libya, and now what's happening to Iran, these are actually successes. Because if Iraq had turned out to be a viable, liberal, democratic state, it would have challenged Saudi Arabia's Wahhabism. It would have challenged Israel on the situation of the Palestinians. It wouldn't, the UAE would not have become the dominant economic force in the region. Iraq was a very educated, deep civilization and so forth. So they didn't want that to happen. It's the same with Iran. If Iran had the day we become a democracy and a women-led democracy, the Saudis won't like it, the UAE won't like it, the Israelis won't like it, the Egyptians, nobody's going to like it, because the region is going to look and say, hey, if Iranian women can do it, why not us? What they wanted was they don't want a strong IRI, Islamic regime. They don't want a failed state, because then you have 80 million Iranians and that causes chaos. They don't want a democracy. They wanted a weakened Islamic Republic. But they want the Islamic Republic to be there in control so that they can negotiate with them. That is exactly what has happened. And it's the game that the Saudis and others have been playing through use of media, through their funding of think tanks in the US that are churning out a lot of this ideology and you know, these ideas and so forth. And then through their negotiations that they've just completed, right? And whatever the deals are that are going to be made, but the deals that are being made are not good for democracy. They're definitely not good for women's rights in the region. It's the only thing that it's good for is to say we're going to have a level of negative peace. People are going to maybe the sanctions will be lifted a little bit so people can eat. You know, hopefully in Yemen there's not going to be bombings anymore and so forth. But it is this is the rise of and re-entrenchment of authoritarianism, and these regimes need each other. Extremists, whether it's sitting in Netanyahu and Khamenei, or they all need each other because they exist because the other exists.
They feed on each other, yeah. Frank, thank you very much. Marianna, also talking about the situation in Iran, there's been, the EU is sort of fixated on the issue of migration. And of course, a lot of Iranians, Afghans also are among the migrants and the refugees who are coming to Europe, seeking shelter, seeking asylum from what we see are very, very difficult circumstances at home. So do you think the EU's attitude towards Iran is going to change because of what's happening there, because of the protests?
Short answer, no. I don't think the EU's attitude when it comes to migration is going to change. I think the EU has a very stable position when it comes to migration, and this is limiting migration, building walls everywhere, not allowing people who could not fit with us within the union. I remember migration and forced migration is the center of my PhD research, but I have also been reporting on that for almost a decade. And I do remember that when we were at the Greek-Macedonian border in 2015, 2016, there were a lot of Iranians coming. And all of a sudden, November 2015, Iranians were left out. And what did they do? They started saying that we are from Afghanistan. And I vividly remember this young couple. They were quite young. They were around 20 years old. And they were like, I started interviewing them. And at some point, once we had built this trust, they told me, you know what, we're not really Afghans. We're from Iran, but we can no longer stay in Iran. And this is something that I have seen quite a lot. Iranians fleeing the regime, seeking freedom. But I don't think the European Union is going to change these attitudes. And if you look at the media, they are pushing for this. What I mean is, if you look, Greece is at the forefront of migration. When the protests in Iran started, every commentator in Greece were like, great freedom for Iranian women. It all became about Iran. But next to this news, you had we have to build the wall in Evros, which is the Greek-Macedonian, the Greek-Turkish land border. And it's something that it was quite odd. We do want freedom for Iranian women, but we don't really want them here because they're going to destroy what we have built. And what we have built is not, it's not open to others.
It's a fortress. It's a fortress Europe.
It is a fortress.
It is a fortress Europe that we built. Thank you very much. So we've got 4 minutes left, and it's been a very, very insightful debate. And I have to say some very cautionary tales there as well, and warnings about how to proceed. But to all three of you, very, very quickly in a minute, looking ahead, what do you foresee in terms of coverage? Do you think that there is now, after all these months of making mistakes and going on off track and engaging in double standards and talking about white saviorism and Orientalist depictions, have we learned any lessons? Do you see any light in this tunnel? Sanam, let's start with you, then Rafia and Marianna.
I mean, you know, the media is the media. They chase after the next shiny object and story. For me, the most important things throughout this whole thing was to try and make sure that when the media attention dies down, which is always inevitable, your diplomats are in place. We have put in place systems that will continue to put the focus on the pressure. So having a human rights rapporteur from the UN is very important. Bringing Iran into the Security Council space on women, peace and security, on sexual violence, these very, in a way, boring, wonky policy stuff, which is the universe that I'm in, that's where these things have to continue. And similarly, in terms of, one of the things was that there was a lot of talk at one point to say, oh, Western diplomats should be pulled out and embassies should be shut down and so forth. I was saying, no, please don't do that, because it'll become like Afghanistan. What we need is governments like Switzerland and others who are very much focused on, part of their diplomacy is banning death sentences, for example, to actually keep that kind of focus on stopping the death sentences, looking at the prison sentences, how do you use your diplomatic presence on the ground to address the prison cases, the long sentences, the injustices, that kind of thing. And also continuing to open the doors. It's counterintuitive, but the more we have openness and the doors opening between Iran and the West and the world, and even within the regime, we've seen people's and their generations, their attitudes have changed. That the mullah's own grandchildren are living a high life in the West, right? So it's the more we shut down, the more we are feeding extremism and the obscurantist isolationists, and the more we open up, you're enabling a natural evolution that is bottom up, which has already happened and it's not going to go away. And I'll just, my cautionary note here is that because the Taliban has been successful in Afghanistan, we are seeing a lot of Islamists around the world, including in Iran, starting to say things like, oh, well, should girls do this or should women do that? We mustn't backtrack. In Iran, we've had 70% of university students have been female. They've been at least 20% of or 19.8% of the formal economic, workforce. Those gains cannot be lost, and that requires consistent engagement, whether it's the media or not. It'd be lovely to have the media involved, but I don't hold my breath for mainstream media to care that much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanam. So very quickly, Rafia, as well. Same message, would you say? Stay engaged, stay connected, don't isolate.
Yeah. Yes, I want to have hope in the wonky policy institutions like Sanam does, but I don't know. I suppose I see the liberal order crumbling day by day. I don't think there is any kind of consensus anymore, even on issues of human rights and freedom of speech, etc. Because as you can see in the U.S., I mean, we're banning books and shutting down libraries. So I mean, I suppose the other side of that in terms of hope is that once things do crumble, the binaries go with them, and people start looking at issues not as over there, but the fact that I understand this because in my small town, they want to shut down the school library. And I think that it's those sorts of awakenings at the absolute ground level that have the potential to change the discourse of world politics.
Thank you, Rafia. Marianna?
I think Rafia and Sanam have already said it. What I'm going to say is that when we see the media misreporting events such as Iran, we need to speak up, especially those of us who work with the media. And we need to be able to say what you're doing is wrong. And you should be amplifying the voices. As the people are saying in the chat, we should be amplifying the voices of those who are inside Iran, and we should not look away, because what is going on is not going to stop. And I think that things are going to be worse. We will not know about it because the media will lose their interest.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. I absolutely agree with you. And I think voices such as ours, yours. We need to amplify them as well because we bring that sophistication and nuance into a conversation. It's extremely frustrating to be based in Brussels and to see members of European Parliament reacting by cutting off locks of their hair, to see some very basic discussions on the hijab and how wonderful it is that women are shrugging it away, throwing it away, discarding it, where in France, making the comparison with Muslim women in Europe, which is completely erroneous and non-contextual. So thank you very much indeed, Sanam, Rafia, and Marianna, for joining me. Thank you for Media Diversity Institute for asking me to moderate and facilitate this very, very important discussion. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for your comments and questions as well. Take care, bye-bye, and see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.